On May the 1st, 1945, the day after his death, German people were told that their Führer had fallen in battle. But they were told to continue the fight against the Bolshevik menace. But the German leadership was falling apart. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann tried to negotiate a citywide ceasefire with the Russians. But the Russian commander, Marshal Zhukov, demanded unconditional surrender of all German forces everywhere. It was more than Goebbels and Bormann could deliver. Fighting in Berlin continued. Later that evening, Goebbels and his wife killed their 6 children and then committed suicide themselves. That same night, Bormann disappeared. Eventually, in the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed that a body found in Berlin was his. The next morning, Berlin surrendered. By mid-afternoon, all fighting in the city had stopped. Across the country, the pace of the German surrender now gathered momentum. The following day, Dönitz sent a delegation to the British commanding officer, Field Marshal Montgomery. He offered to surrender all German forces in northern Germany. Montgomery sent a reply saying he didn't have the authority to accept a surrender on behalf of the Americans or the Russians. He could only accept the surrender of those troops fighting him. Dönitz had no choice but to agree to Montgomery's terms. But that left Germany still fighting in the rest of the country. Dönitz now sent another delegation to General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, to discuss a peace deal with the West, but it carefully avoided any reference to a surrender to the Russians. Eisenhower rebuffed him and insisted that only the unconditional surrender of all German forces was acceptable. Once again, Dönitz was forced to back down. At 2:41 in the morning of May the 7th, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in France, General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations throughout the 6 years of war, signed a document of unconditional surrender. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, signed for the Western Allies. General Ivan Suslopurov signed for the Soviet Union. The only member of the Allies' side not happy with the arrangement was Stalin. The Soviet Union had suffered too much to miss out on its own humiliation of the Germans. So Stalin countermanded Suslopurov and declared Russia would only accept a surrender in Berlin. It meant that the following day, Hitler's former chief of staff, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signed a second surrender document to satisfy Stalin. Marshal Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union, with Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signing on behalf of the Western Allies.
In January 1943, the late President Roosevelt and Premier Churchill met in Casablanca. There they pronounced the formula of unconditional surrender for the Axis powers. In Europe, that formula has now been fulfilled.
Across Europe and the United States, crowds began to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. From now on, the day after the German surrender, May the 8th, would be known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. But as the celebrations continued, many were aware of two very sobering issues. In the East, Japan was still fighting. And in Europe, the continent lay in ruins, and huge problems needed to be solved. Millions of Germany's concentration camp victims and slave laborers would need help to rebuild their lives. Millions of captured German fighting men had to be screened before being allowed to go home to identify and arrest major war criminals. The SS was a particular target. It had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war. Leading Nazis like Hermann Goering, head of Hitler's Air Force, were rounded up and paraded in front of the cameras. Other top Nazis arrested included civilian leaders like Albert Speer and military leaders like Jodl and Dönitz. They would be put on trial in the German city of Nuremberg for crimes against humanity.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Rudolf Hess, you must plead guilty or not guilty.
Nein.
That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
The Nazi leadership received sentences ranging from the death penalty to 10 years in prison. Goering committed suicide before he could be hung. Two months after the German surrender, the Allies met in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, British, American, and French. Berlin, although deep in the Soviet zone, was parceled up between the Allies in the same way. The peoples of Europe would also find themselves divided. Some would now live under the control of the Western Allies, some under Communist Russia. But before any of this could be faced, there was still the war in the Pacific to be won.